Whew, okay. Now for the tough stuff. Boy, I'm telling you, if you thought we'd seen some tough stuff so far, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now for the tough stuff. So, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Excuse me. Know and understand this. Okay, so that's the mission statement. Now let's break that down a little bit and explain what that means, or at least some of what that means. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes. That's the Anointed, that's the Messiah. That's the guy we're waiting for. We have heard about this guy for a long time now. Micah talked about him, Isaiah talked about him, Ezekiel talked about him, Jeremiah talked about him. Like, we have been, even Moses talked about him, really, when he said there will be a prophet like me someday. Like, we've been hearing about, God himself talked about the seed of the woman back in Genesis chapter 3. Okay? We have been waiting for this guy for a long time now. We've been talking about this guy, and now we know he's going to come. He's going to come at some point during these 77. So from the issuing of the decree, or the word, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the Anointed One comes, the ruler, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So for whatever the reason, this 77 period, this period of 77s is being broken up into a period of 7 sevens and 62 sevens, whatever the reason. The city will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. And that will essentially be the story of the rest of the Old Testament. From now until the end of the Old Testament, we're going to be reading about them rebuilding this city in times of trouble. That will essentially be the first 7 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, and that's essentially is a period of time between the testaments. We don't have a prophetic word from God that comes during that time. Now, he has given us a preview, and he will continue to give us a preview in Daniel 10, 11, and 12 of this time period. Daniel has given us a preview of this time period in the form of these empires that's going to come. Okay, at this point, we're in the empire of the Persians. So going back to Nebuchadnezzar's statue and the dream of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, and Daniel's vision of beasts, we're already on number 2. We passed the head of gold and the winged lion. We're down now on the arms and chest of silver, or the bear, the lopsided bear. And eventually that kingdom's going to pass away and be replaced by the third one, which is the belly and thighs of bronze, and Nebuchadnezzar's vision, and the leopard with 4 wings. And Daniel's vision, we read more detail about that in Daniel 8. We're going to read more detail about that in 10, 11, and 12. And that kingdom will eventually pass away and will be replaced by the fourth kingdom, which is feet of iron, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay, and Nebuchadnezzar's vision, and the indescribably horrifying beast. Daniel's vision, which you flipped ahead to Revelation and saw, was the Roman Empire, which replaced the Grecian Empire, and incorporated elements of all the previous empires into it, which is why it was such a horrible, horrifying beast, because it was made up of parts of all the previous beasts. Alright, that period of time is the 62 sevens. And God will be silent during that time. He has already, by the time those 62 sevens get underway, the first 7 sevens finish, the next 62 sevens come, by the time they get to there, God has said all he's going to say, and he has gone silent, And the Jews at that point will have nothing but the already revealed written word to go on. And that's enough. I mean, that's all we have now. Okay? Yeah, that is enough. But he is not going to be coming to speak to them by the mouths of prophets during that time. Which I believe is probably why he divided, because during the first 7 sevens, he is still going to be speaking to them through prophets. In the second set of 62 sevens, he is not. And I believe that is why those 2 periods of time are divided up, I believe. It doesn't say that, okay? Like there's nothing in this text or anywhere else that explains why these 77s are broken up this way. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And different people will try to tell you different things about what that means. My personal belief is that these 77s are broken up this way because in the first 7 sevens, which essentially equates to the rest of the Old Testament, God was still sending prophets to the people. He had Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. He had Ezra and Nehemiah. They weren't really prophets, but they contributed to the written canon of the Old Testament. He was still speaking to them directly, either through the mouths or pens of prophets. Then he stopped doing that. And then he went through a long 400-year stretch where he did not do that again. Did not do that anymore. And that's the 62 sevens. So that is my belief of why he breaks this 77s up in these categories. After the 62 sevens, so during the 70th seven, the Anointed One will be cut off and will have nothing. The footnote says, cut off and will have no one, or cut off but not for himself. And what cut off means, that's basically the death penalty. We read about that a lot back in the law. Again, this is all legal language here. When you committed certain kinds of sins, you were to be cut off from the people. Now, in some cases, that may refer to exile. But in some cases, it refers to the death penalty. Remember the Day of Atonement, they had 2 goats, and they killed one, the death penalty, and they sent one into exile as a scapegoat, carrying the sins, symbolically, didn't actually do this, but symbolically carrying the sins away from the community. So it could be either the death penalty, the direct, just cut off, or it could be cut off in the sense of exile, or it could basically mean both. You know, Jesus ultimately was the ultimate atonement, and he was both cut off in the sense that he was killed, and cut off in the sense that he was exiled. So he ended up, experiencing both kinds of punishments. So the cut off refers to Jesus' death. That's where the Anointed One will be cut off. He will be excommunicated from the people and suffer the death penalty. And he will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come. Now that happened in Jesus' life and ministry. That's a culmination of it. His death, of course, his resurrection. But now we're skipping ahead to something that happens about 40. Now you have to remember, and this is okay. We're going to have that. We've already had this happen. Okay, we should be familiar with this by now because as this book has gone on, we have covered great periods of history in very few words. Okay, Daniel lives in the 500s BC, and he is talking about things that go down to 600 or so years after his time. And he has 12 chapters to do it in, about 10 pages in our printed Bibles to do that in. So as he covers this material in vision form and in dream form or whatever, we've been kind of skipping large chunks of time very quickly. And we've done that in other books too. We've done that in other books of the Bible too. I mentioned, for example, back in Isaiah, we read about the death of Sennacherib after his invasion of Judah. He surrounds the city of Jerusalem, does not successfully conquer it. His army is defeated. He is not killed in that judgment. He goes back to Nineveh, or Assyria, dejected and depressed. And immediately we read about him being put to death by his sons. Well, in history, it sounds like it all happened like in the same breath of events, like in the same breath. He goes back to the city and he gets killed. Well, it didn't happen that way, okay? When he went back, that happened like 20 years later. Sennacherib actually outlived Hezekiah, his opponent, in Jerusalem. Sennacherib wasn't actually put to death by his sons for about 20 years after he invaded Judah and Jerusalem and besieged Jerusalem. But the text doesn't sound like that. The text makes it sound like it happened all immediately. That's just the way these things are written sometimes. Okay? Later on in chapter 11, we get this continuous sequence of events that predict the future. We're going to be talking about things that in some cases are decades or centuries apart, and we're going to be just kind of going through them very rapidly as if it's happening one thing after another. But it isn't. Okay? It's happening lifetimes apart. Okay? We're going to be talking about the king of Syria versus the king of Egypt. And we're going to be talking about as though it's one king fighting the other king the whole time. But it's actually a whole line of kings from Syria versus a whole line of kings from Egypt, and it's covering about 200 or so years in history, even though it doesn't sound like it. Okay, and there's going to be other instances where we suddenly skip ahead a century or two or three or four or whatever very quickly. So that's happening here. The Anointed One being cut off is the Messiah being crucified and cut off and rejected and killed. The next thing we read about is the destruction of the city, which happens 40 years later. Jesus' death was probably in the year 33 AD. And in the year 70 AD, so about 40 years later, there was actually in the late 60s AD, Rome and Judea went to war with each other. There was a breakout of war, and the Romans came to fight against the Jews, and they fought for several years actually. And the centerpiece of this battle, like the culminating event, not the end of it actually, there was still unrest and trouble in the land for several years thereafter. The actual end of the war didn't come until 73 AD. But the big, climactic moment of this war was in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, like Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had centuries before. And that was it. That was the final end of the Jewish state as a commonwealth before God, as a nation before God. That happened about 40 years later. So Messiah, the Anointed One, was cut off in verse 26 here, and then it says the heap of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and sanctuary. That happens about 40 years later. So between those two sentences, there is a gap of about 40 years. So after the 62 sevens, after that long period of time in which God goes silent, and you're having trouble with the Persians and the Greeks and then the Romans, the Anointed One will come. He came after the 69th seven. We read about that. Until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there'll be 69 seven and then 62. So after that 69th seven and the 70th seven, the Anointed One will be cut. So he will come, and then he'll be cut off, and you'll have nothing. And then the people, the ruler who will come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. This is the end of the Jewish state. Now Gabriel is giving this message to a Jew. Okay? He's giving this message to Daniel, who is living in captivity in Babylon, and is praying for the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple. So he's telling him, yes, that's going to happen. That's going to happen like right away, in fact. We're going to get to that immediately. That's the next thing on the agenda. But that's not the end goal, Daniel. You got to think bigger than that. God's purposes are not tied only to that temple. So not just 70 years, but 77s are going to be necessary to accomplish all of God's purposes, which are going to happen when this Anointed One comes. And that's going to be after the 69th seven. And then when the Anointed One comes, he's going to be cut off. And then when that happens, the end will come like a flood. And that's the end of the Jewish state. War will continue until the end. The Jews are going to be at war constantly. And desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. So that's the last 7. That's the 70th 7. And that's the 70th 7 that's going on to this day even. And there's not going to be any more sacrifices and offerings because Jesus finished that. We don't need to offer sacrifices and offerings anymore because Jesus offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice, as the only true atoning sacrifice. All those sacrifices that they offered up in the past didn't ultimately do anything. They were just symbolic. They were instructive. Now, God told them to do it, so they should have done it. Like they were supposed to do it because God told them to. But those sacrifices were not taking away their sins. God was forgiving their sins not on the basis of those sacrifices, or even on the basis of their obedience to those sacrifices, because they were told to offer them. So doing so was being obedient to God. That was not what was getting their sins forgiven. Their sins were forgiven based on what God knew he would do at the cross someday when he offered up the one true sacrifice for all time in the person of Jesus. God knew that was going to happen. He had always known that was going to happen. And that is the basis on which he was forgiving sins that occurred even before that happened. It's been the basis of forgiveness ever since that happened. But it was also the basis of forgiveness ever since even before that happened. That was always the basis of forgiveness. The basis of forgiveness was never about offering bulls and goats and lambs. They were told to do that, so it was right and proper and obedient for them to do that. But that was not actually accomplishing anything in terms of forgiveness. When Jesus comes and offers himself and gets cut off, there will be no further need for sacrifices or offerings, so he will put an end to that at when he establishes this covenant for 1 week, for 1/7. Now, I don't like the default translation here in the new NIV version for this upcoming verse. There is a footnote down here with an alternate translation, which I prefer. I'm going to read the default translation here, and then I will read the footnote translation on here, which I prefer better, and then I will explain why I prefer the alternate translation. And on the wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Now, this sounds like it's the Anointed One doing this, which is why I don't prefer this translation, this version of this translation. Until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, down here we have a footnote saying this. And one who causes desolation will come upon the pinnacle of the abominable temple, until the end that it is decreed is poured out on the desolated city. I prefer that, because the reason why this passage is so tricky is because we have convinced ourselves, for whatever the reason, and I don't know why, but we have convinced ourselves that the he being referred to here is not the Anointed One, but is this prince who is to come, which is mentioned in verse 20. Where is he? Or the ruler who is to come, who is mentioned in verse 26. Okay. We have gotten out of that. Now, that's just a statement of historical fact. That just means the Romans are going to destroy the city. And we have seen that mentioned already in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, that we're going up to the time of that fourth kingdom and no further. In Daniel 2, we see the fourth kingdom, and it's during that kingdom that the God sets up his own kingdom, the rock that shatters the whole statue and grows to cover the whole earth. In Daniel 7, we see the fourth beast being destroyed and thrown into the fire, and the kingdom being given to the saints after the one like the Son of Man is scored in the presence of the Ancient of Days. So it's during that fourth kingdom, which is the Roman Empire, which we've identified from both Daniel and John in Revelation, that this kingdom is established. It's during the fourth kingdom that Jesus was born. He was born when shortly after Augustus became emperor of Rome, during Augustus' time. His ministry occurred during the reign of Tiberius. It was during the days of that fourth kingdom that Jesus had his ministry, and during the days that which the church formed, and the church is that kingdom on earth that becomes a rock that covers the whole earth. So he is the Anointed One, and he is the he spoken of throughout this section. For some reason, though, we have gotten in our heads that there is a subject switch. We go from the Anointed One to somebody else in verse 26, and that the he in verse 27 is somebody else, not the Anointed One. We view this as some future figure who has not yet come into world history, and call him the Antichrist. We have absolutely no basis for thinking this, actually, whatsoever. The passage itself makes it pretty, and again, with the whole context of the book of Daniel around it, which again, I mentioned earlier, each of these incidents is a separate incident in the life of Daniel, okay? But all of this book of Daniel forms a whole. And we need to read the book of Daniel as a whole, because it is a whole. We have 10 separate incidents in the book of Daniel recorded from the lifetime of Daniel. We have 10 separate incidents in the lifetime of Daniel recorded in the book of Daniel. And each of these needs to be looked at individually, but they also need to be looked at as part of a whole. And we have seen consistently, and we'll see it again in the next vision, in Daniel's 10 to 12, that Daniel's visions go up to the time of Rome. They go up to the days in which God establishes his own kingdom, and as it turns out, brings an end to this kingdom. This kingdom of the Jews is not intended to last forever. It's going to bring in the Anointed One, and the Anointed One is going to accomplish these 6 goals, which we mentioned in God's mission statement there in verse 24. That's God's mission statement. He's going to accomplish that in those 77s, that period of time. So it's not just about the temple. Daniel wanted to know about the temple. And he knew there were going to be 70 years decreed for the temple, and he wanted to know if that time was going to be up so people could go back and build that temple again. And he's being given a mission here saying, yes, that's going to happen, but there's a greater purpose in mind than just that temple. God has all these 6 things he's going to do. He's going to accomplish through his Anointed One, his ruler. And here's a time frame it's going to happen in. And when that happens, he's going to get cut off. We read about that actually already in Isaiah. That he's going to be rejected and cast aside. We read about that in Isaiah 50 and 51 and 52, the suffering servant. That he's going to be stricken, smitten, and afflicted. So he'll be cut off, and then after that, the people, the ruler will come, will destroy the city and sanctuary again. It's already been destroyed. In Daniel's day, it's still destroyed. It's going to be rebuilt, as the angel says here, and it's going to be destroyed again by another group of people. Okay, and that's going to be the Romans. And we know that. And that happened in history. Jesus himself will say that when he gives his discourse to his disciples in Matthew 24 and 25, and Luke 21 and Mark 13. He's going to say this. That's going to happen. All these things that Daniel talks about is going to happen here. We'll look at that actually a little bit later. And that did happen. We know that historically that did happen. You go to Jerusalem today and you won't find a temple there. Alright. The sacrifices and offerings have been put an end to. And that was all done by the Anointed One. And he made a covenant for that last week, that 70th week, which is still ongoing to this day. There's nothing literal about these 77s. There's really no reason even to take it as literal. I understand there is something of a practical basis in this, because Daniel himself had been reading in Jeremiah about a period of 70 years, which he apparently took to mean a literal 70 years, and may well have meant a literal 70 years, or at least close to it, around maybe 68 years, rounded off to 70, I'm not sure. So there is some basis for looking at these 77s as a literal period of 77s or 70 weeks, or how there's all kinds of, but we don't have any instructions for how to actually make that a period of time. What does that 77 mean? Okay, that word 7 there is basically just a unit of 7. In fact, there's a lot of times in the scriptures when that word appears, it's translated as week. So you could, in our footnote, in fact, down here does say 70 weeks. So 70 weeks. What does that even mean? We don't know. We're not given any interpretive principle to be able to say this means something. We don't know what that 77 means in terms of an actual unit of time. We know what the 70 years of Jeremiah meant. Jeremiah said that, he said it twice, in fact. Daniel reads it here and interprets it to mean 70 years. Okay, so we know that was an actual 70-year period of time. But we don't have any such confirmation telling us how to interpret these 77s. Whether that is 77s, what is that? Okay, let's say that's 77 to 70 weeks. That's 490 weeks. Okay, there's no way to make a literal period of 490 weeks cover this whole stretch of time. We basically have the rest of the Old Testament, the time period of the rest of the Old Testament. From this point until the end of the Old Testament, it's going to be about 100 years. And that's basically the first 7 sevens. There's no way to make 7 sevens or 49 weeks into 100 plus years. Like it's a year. 49 weeks is basically about a year. Okay. So 70 weeks is 490 weeks, which is a period of a few years. All right. That doesn't cover that time frame from now until the Anointed One coming. There's really no way to fit that. You call it 70 weeks of years? Some people say it's 70 weeks of years. That means it's 490 years. But we don't have anything in the text that justifies us doing that. Like, we don't have any principle or guideline given to us to say that we have permission to do that. We do have obvious examples in the Old Testament and the New Testament of 70 or some multiple of 7, or 7 or some multiple of 7 being used figuratively to indicate perfectness and completeness. We do have that. Jesus himself says you shouldn't forgive your brother 77 times, or 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Okay? Now 70 times 7 itself in that case is not meant to be taken literally, because that's 490 times. Jesus is not saying you can forgive your brother 490 times, but the 491st time, no more forgiveness. He's not saying that. The 70 times 7 itself is meant to be superlative and hyperbolic about forgiving him forever. Complete and total forgiveness. However many times he needs you to forgive him, you forgive him. You don't keep track. You don't say 7 times is enough. You don't say 490 times is enough. And however many times he needs you to forgive him, you forgive him. So we have, and we read the book of Revelation, we see the number 7 all over the place in terms of perfectness and completion. Even that idea of week, the 7-day week, is meant to communicate a perfect period of time. God set up the universe in 7 days, a week. And we base our calendars to this day off of that 7-week period. Why do we do that? Why do we have calendars to this day that are based off a 7-week period? We don't need to. We can base our calendars off of anything. We don't have to have a week that just takes place over 7 days. You can make it 5 days. You can make it 10 days. You can make it 20 days. We don't have to make a monthly calendar based on 7-day weeks. We can make the week anything. The sun doesn't care. The moon doesn't care. The plants don't care. The animals don't care. Why should we care? Why do we base all of our calendars off of 7-day weeks? Well, it comes from somewhere, doesn't it? So that is, we don't have, I used to think that this meant a literal period of time. And I used to try to figure out, when was the starting point, when was the ending point. It's not. Okay, 77 does not communicate the idea of a literal period of 490 years or however many days. It just does not do that. He's basically saying 70 years may have, but these 77s do not. And we have a governing principle to allow us to say that 70 years meant 70 years, because Daniel understood it to mean 70 years. And Gabriel said, and he was right about that. Gabriel said, your answer is given to you. Okay, those 70 years were meant to be seen and understood as 70 years. But we have no such confirmation that these 77s are meant to be understood the same way. And there's no way to make them fit into history under any method of interpretation in terms of trying to make it a literal frame of time. There's no way to make it fit into history and actually, communicate and actually fit numerically into the allotment of days that we assign for it. So what we have here is 3 periods of time. We have basically the rest of the Old Testament when God was still sending prophets to the people. We have the long period of silence between the Testaments when God was not sending prophets to the people. And then we have the arrival of the Anointed One. And it's during that time that he fulfills all these things. He fulfills God's mission statement. He puts an end to sacrifice and offering. And he is cut off. And it's because of that abominable act that desolation is decreed and poured out. That's what that last verse is saying. Let's read the footnoted version of that line again. One who causes desolation will come upon the pinnacle of the abominable temple, until the end that is decreed is poured out from the desolated city. Because of the act of cutting off the Anointed One, desolation is decreed. It says here that even desolations have been decreed. The end will come like a flood. The war will continue until the end. Okay? That's because of the cutting off of the Anointed One. The rejection of the Messiah brings about the end, and that happens about 40 years. So Jesus himself says that. Now we will look at this in more detail once we get to Daniel 10, 11, and 12. But Jesus himself interprets this meaning this way. near the end of his ministry, he's in Jerusalem, and he's giving long speeches of denunciation against the religious leaders there. In Matthew 24, verse 1, it says, Jesus left the temple. Actually, right before that, the lines right before that, this is like his farewell speech to Jerusalem at this point in time. It's right after this that he can begin the crucifixion story. His last lines in Matthew, right before he leaves the city and the temple, are, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem. This is Matthew 23, starting in verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you that you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So he's saying right there that you're going to be left desolate again, like you were before. And he leaves the temple and walks away when his disciples come up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He's asked. I tell you the truth. Not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. They interpret this to mean the end of the age. So they come up to him afterwards and say, tell us when this will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. Now, we're not going to read the rest of this just yet. We'll get to that later. But he gives them several things to look for. And by the way, all these things did happen in the lead up to the Roman-Judea War, which started in the late 60s AD. So these are all historical events. Everything he lists here from verse 6 on down are things that actually happened in history and that you can read about if you read the history of that time period. It's not a mystery, it's not obscure, it's not referring to something that's going to happen thousands of years later. It's referring to things that happened in that day and time. And then he says in verse 15, when you see standing in the holy place, by the way, he also says, let's skip ahead a bit here, excuse me. In verse 34, just to give you a sneak preview, he says, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So what he means by that is that these things are going to happen while some people of that generation are still alive to see them. So back up to verse 15, he says, so it's practical advice to them, because some of them are still going to be alive when these things happen, 40 years or so later. And he says in verse 15, going back to verse 15, he says, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, because the city is about to be destroyed. And Luke interprets this to mean this. We don't have to guess what that abomination of desolation is, because Luke tells us. Matthew is writing for a Hebrew Jewish audience. Luke is writing for a Gentile audience. So he doesn't speak about it in terms of some Jewish imagery. He says this. Oops. Where are we here? Luke 21. He says it this way. When you see Luke 21, verse 20, this is a parallel passage where he's giving the same sermon as recorded in Matthew, but with a different spin on it. To accommodate the different perspective of the writer and the reader. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you know this desolation is near. That actually happened in history when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies at the beginning of the Roman-Judea War. Those armies did not attack Jerusalem at that time. They were recalled and left and came back later. So there was a period of time in the Roman-Judea War when Jerusalem was temporarily surrounded by armies. That is the abomination of desolation that he was talking about, according to Luke. And that is the sign that they were to watch for to know when to leave the city, and they did. And then the Romans came back, the war resumed, and ultimately resulted in the complete destruction of the city and the temple. And that happened in AD 70, in the late summer of AD 70. And that is what Daniel 9 is talking about. Daniel 9 is not talking about some still future figure called the Antichrist. There is no such person. John makes it clear the spirit of the Antichrist is already here, and it's anyone who denies the Christ. That's it. That's all there is to the Antichrist. There is no singular future person called the Antichrist who's going to come and conquer the world. I mean, there may be. I mean, I'm not denying the possibility or even the likelihood that some evil government will conquer the world. Okay, I mean, we're definitely trending in that direction. But if that does happen, there's not going to be like an Antichrist figure that the Bible prophesies will still come and bring about the end of the world. That is total fiction, total malarkey. And the Antichrist itself is the spirit of anyone who denies the Christ. That's all that is. There is no future figure to come, singular individual known as the Antichrist, who will bring about Armageddon. That is total fantasy. All of Daniel 9 is referring to the upcoming arrival of the Anointed One, who will bring about his kingdom, which all the prophets talked about. We know now it's going to happen during the time of the Fourth Empire, from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to Rome. Okay? And we know it's going to happen after these 77s, 7 sevens, 62 sevens, and that 70th seven. He will confirm a covenant with me for 1 7. He'll put an end to sacrifice and offering. He will be cut off and will have nothing. After that, the end of the city will come like a flood, and there will be desolation and abomination, not brought about by the Anointed One, but brought about by the rejection of the Anointed One. That's why I don't like the standard translation there, because it makes it seem like he is the one doing that, because the writers, the translators are putting the Antichrist into that passage when there is no such thing. So the abomination that causes desolation happens as a result of, or on the wings of, the rejection or the cutting off of the Anointed One. But he will still establish his kingdom, and it's going to grow and fill the whole earth, what the New Testament is about. And that's what we're living in right now. So we're still living in that 70th week. That 70th week is not future. It's not literal. It's not a literal period of 7 days or 7 years or whatever. It's going on right now. That 70th week is still ongoing, and the 70 weeks themselves are not to be understood as a literal period of time. And you can't make it a period, and you can't make it so no matter what you do, whether you call it 490 weeks or 490 days or 490 years. There's no way to do it. We have no authority to do it. There's nothing in the text saying that it should be understood that way, and we have no principles established anywhere else saying that we should understand it that way. In fact, the principles of the 77s themselves, established throughout the rest of the Bible, indicate that we should not understand it that way, and so the 77s are not to be taken as a literal period of time, and we are still currently living in that 70th week. So that is Daniel 9, and as before, I have spoken so much, I'm done for the day. I wanted to get through all of Daniel today, but Daniel 10 to 12 are just going to have to wait. I can't do it. Daniel, there is just so much to talk about when it comes to the book of Daniel. I just cannot get everything done while preserving my voice and my health. It's also getting cold. I can feel the cold air coming into the window, and I want to get away from that, so I am done. And I said earlier that this is a cold day, and the temperatures have been dropping, and the winds are picking up, and I am starting to feel it as the winds start coming through the drafty window and the door that I have over there. So I'm going to take shelter in my warmer parts of my apartment, so I'm not going to continue on with this today, and that's it.